So I hope everybody is doing okay. Here we are, Monday evening, the middle of September. Golden Thumb. And again, I know the Zoom and the online format is not ideal, especially for any type of speaking or asking questions or sharing of views. But if you do have something you want to ask or say, I encourage you. It's most welcome. So I'm going to start tonight with 4 verses from the Dhammapada, the verses 3 to 6. And you probably are familiar with them. They kind of bring us to the theme of tonight's discussion. You'll understand why. When we hold on to such thoughts as, they abused me, they molested me, they mistreated me, they robbed me, we keep the hatred alive. If we thoroughly release ourselves from such thoughts as, they abused me, they molested me, they mistreated me, they robbed me, hatred is vanquished. Ended. Never by hatred is hatred conquered, but by love alone. This is an eternal law. And finally, the last verse, number 6. Those who are contentious, meaning you have argumentative or hostile, those who are contentious have forgotten that we all die. For the wise who reflect on this fact, there are no quarrels. So this brings us a bit to the topic of forgiveness that I wanted to explore with you a little. I'm right across the street of a yeshiva, and a Hasidic yeshiva that very early in the morning they're meeting now. I think it's for slichot. So it's a kind of, I guess, forgiveness practice. Contentious, yeah. And it got me thinking about what kind of a similar practice do we have in our Dharma practice, and in terms of forgiveness and release. And I think what we just read was a kind of expression of that, where the Buddha said, if we thoroughly release ourselves from these thoughts, hatred is vanquished. So there's 2 things here in these verses that I just read in the Dhammapada that are pointing directly to a type of practice that we can call forgiveness practice. And one is that we all carry with us a certain sorrow and grief and anger, contention, aggression, and hostility. And usually, or I can say always, the result of having received, mistreatment. So, very few. It's not the general nature to be angry and upset or grieving, but it's in response to actions, speech, thought, and actions that one's received. Now, those actions are past, but the anger, resentment, hostility, and feelings of blame remain. They remain. There's a Tibetan story of a couple of monks who were walking after being released from prison, and one of them said, and having been tortured in prison, and one of them said to the other, have you forgiven our captors? Have you forgiven the guards? And he said, no, I'll never do that. And the first said to him, well, then you're still in prison, aren't you? So if we can frame this idea of forgiveness as not necessarily absolving the other of responsibility, those guards are still responsible for the karma of violence they have created and for their own actions. We're not releasing them of responsibility, but what we want to do is release the anger, hostility, and pain and sorrow and lamentation that we carry as a result of the inflictions we've received. This is the point of the practice of forgiveness. In short, we're not doing it for them. We're doing it for us, so that we can live more freely and not be held prisoner by the wrongs that have been done, either to ourselves or to others. Now, there's three directions of forgiveness, of course. There's when we forgive someone else for something they've done. When we ask forgiveness from someone else for a wrong we've done. When we forgive ourselves for a wrong we've done. All of these are the practice of letting go, a practice of release. And I want to look at that a little more in terms of the stages of how it works. So, and of course, there's another, I was reading another really wonderful example that has been told before. It was told by Jack Cornfield, who was meeting with some Tibetan nuns and the Dalai Lama. And these Tibetan nuns had been in Chinese prisons, and they were meeting with some prisoners from the United States, some former prisoners who were using meditation to help them with their lives. And so there's a sort of cross-cultural meeting going on of two sets of former prisoners from very different causes and conditions. And the one set of prisoners from the American prisons asked the nuns, who are these little, Tibetan nuns, were you ever afraid? They spent many years in Chinese prisons being, tortured. And they said, oh yes, we were terribly afraid. We were terrified. Oh yeah, really? Yes, we were afraid that we would start hating the Chinese. We were afraid of that. That's what they were afraid of. When they left the meeting, one of the American prisoners, ex-convicts, said, to them that he's met a lot of brave people, but these were the bravest people he's ever met. So one of the other examples I want to use, and the story that I want to use, that comes from also the traditional sutras stories, is of the monk Angulimala. And we've spoken of him in years past. Angulimala is a really interesting case in the sutras of this bandit and terrible criminal who was terrorizing the countryside and trying to kill 1,000 people. And they say he had a necklace with 999 fingers, and he needed one more. And the king sent out the king's Pasenadi, who was the king at the time of that area, sent out 500 soldiers to go capture him and kill him. And his mother, Angulimala's mother, went out to try to stop him from killing anyone else and change his ways, and to warn him about soldiers coming, to try to save him before it was too late. So that's a mother's compassion. But lo and behold, he was going to actually kill her as his final finger that he needed to complete his, reign of terror. The Buddha became aware of all this, and he wanted to go out and stop him from killing the mother, because he knew if he killed 1,000, then it would be very difficult for him to change his ways. I don't know, 1,000 was some special number. You should never get to 1,000 murders. So he goes and he meets him in the forest, and Gulimala was, planning to kill him. And, he changed his plans from killing his mother to killing the Buddha. But he was so taken aback by the Buddha just doing walking meditation, walking so peacefully in a forest that all the villagers had fled from. And it was known as the most dangerous place. And Angulimala said to the Buddha, stop walking so peacefully. And the Buddha replies, I, Angulimala, am standing still, having for all beings laid aside the stick, the rod, meaning I'm not going to hurt anybody. But you are unrestrained concerning creatures. Therefore, I'm standing still, and you, Angulimala, are not standing still. Another version says, I've stopped, Angulimala. Now you should stop. I like this one more. I'm standing still, and you're not. So apparently, Angulimala had a sort of a conversion experience, or at least he was convinced, and sort of the veil fell off his eyes, and he understood, and he asked to be the disciple of the Buddha. And the Buddha brought him back to the monastery, and he became a disciple and a monk. Of course, a lot of the monks sort of objected because they also were afraid of this guy. And it was hard for them to let go of their fear, anger, and accusations. But one day, King Pasenadi was passing through and visited the Buddha at his sort of monastery. And the Buddha asked him, he said, what if there was a terrible criminal who had become a monk? How would you relate to him? And the king said, well, I would honor him. And the Buddha said, well, here he is. He pointed beside him to Angulimala and said, well, here he is. And the king honored him and offered to give him robes and stuff, but Angulimala refused any benefits. And the king decided that he would refrain from punishing Angulimala, even though he was a wanted murderer. So this story, and it goes on a bit, that I'll continue in a second, because it also ends in an interesting way. This story so far in the Pali Sutras is a real interesting example of this type of forgiveness, which means that what was necessary, there's a couple of things we can notice from the story, and I'm sure more things that you'll notice than what I'm going to bring up. Number one, what the Buddha is focused on is the person, not the action, is what he can become, not what he was. And that's a real important thing. One of the really difficult things that ex-convicts and prisoners face is that they're sort of branded for life with the mark of Cain, and it's hard for them to get a job to move on, because forever they're now what's called an ex-convict. That's now their identity. And what the Buddha saw was another Buddha. The Buddha saw another Buddha. And that's really a vast and profound view. So it does not mean that he didn't see all the past karma as well. He saw the potential of this person to overcome his past karma. Now, not all of us have that strength of Angulimala, to do that. So that's one level of forgiveness, is seeing the wholeness of the person and not just his mistakes. And the second aspect of forgiveness is King Pasenadi. And that's really interesting too. He was like, okay, I accept this as a monk. He had full ability to arrest and execute him, which was really within his right as the main lawgiver, but he didn't. So, and he wasn't just giving in to the Buddha's authority. That was sort of his, also as a lay person, his act of forgiveness. Now, the story goes on a bit in an interesting way. Another episode of this story is that a little while later, Angulimala, when he's doing some walking meditation, comes across a young woman who's giving birth, ironically, and having a very painful childbirth. And he's profoundly moved by the pain she's experiencing in childbirth during labor, difficult labor. And it arouses his compassion. And he goes to the Buddha and asks, how can he help? And the Buddha says to him, you should go to the woman and say to her, sister, since I was born, I do not recall that I've ever intentionally deprived a living being of life. By this truth, may you be well and may your infant be well. I don't call ever killing anyone. So by this truth, you should, and by the merit sort of my never having taken a life, you should, and your child should live. And Angulimala said to the Buddha, but that's not true. That's not true. That's not true. It would be untrue for him to say, he said. So the Buddha responds with a revision. He then says, sister, since I was born with a noble birth, I do not recall ever having taken the life intentionally, deprived a living being of life. So by its merit, may you and your infant be well. So the process here is not just that we, have stopped from causing harm, but we want to have, in these words, a noble birth. Meaning you got to take your practice, your intentions, your vows, and your precepts with full commitment. Starting with, of course, the 5 precepts of not taking life and not speaking untruths and not having harmful sexuality and not having intoxicants. So we can have to take those very, very seriously. And finally, the last episode with Angulimala is that when he died, before he died, he was spotted by some villagers, and they recognized him. And they didn't have the same forgiveness and depth of view and vision that that the Buddha had. And they were stoning him and throwing stones at him, and he was hurt and bloodied. And he actually died soon after that. Now, he died, and the other monks, of course, who still recall all of this history, asked the Buddha, what kind of rebirth is he going to have? Like, he killed 999 people, and sure, he was a monk for a few years, but come on, what's his rebirth going to be? The Buddha stated that Angulimala had achieved nirvana. And they wondered how someone who had killed so many people, the Sangha members, they asked, how could someone who had killed so many people have attained enlightenment in one life? And the Buddha said that even after a person did much evil, there still remains a possibility to change and achieve enlightenment. And that's the source of forgiveness, is to see that potential within each person, no matter what they have done. Now that's one aspect of it, is seeing that with a big mind, the vastness, seeing that vast reality of each person. That just in the same way we want to be viewed as our, greatest potential and not by our worst mistakes, so too should we grant others that view. Does it mean that you don't see those mistakes, that you've ignored them? No, not at all. Not at all. Okay? Forgiving doesn't mean forgetting, but it means seeing the greatness. And first of all, where do we start? We start with having to see the vastness of our own minds. You can't forgive someone else and see the potential of them to achieve full enlightenment in this very lifetime, as the Buddha saw with Angulimala. I mean, that's a profound example, and it's an extreme one. And it took an extreme, person like the Buddha to do that. But here we had two extremes, like someone who killed 1,000 people and the Buddha. Okay, now we live on a much less extreme level, which means that we have that possibility. You don't start with someone who's killed or with someone who has raped or hurt. That's not your starting point with forgiveness. Right? Forgiveness is a process. And it's a process of letting go and allowing something bigger than what you think. First of all, with your own mind. So there are a few stages that I'd like to go over in terms of this process. And remember, the intention here, as with a lot of our meditation practice, is to widen your perspective and open the doors of your view to have a right view and a wide view and a big view of who and what you are and who and what others are. Because the small view or the relative view is very judgmental, and it's painful because the narrowness fills us with all the grief that we're collecting over time. Yeah, there's joy too, and there's lots of goodness. But, as we go along, basically, we're grief collectors. We experience more harm. There's more crap going on in the world. There's more mistakes we've made, and more things that other people have done. And even something that happened way long ago, if you haven't gone through this process, it doesn't stay static, but it becomes calcified with time. It becomes harder. And that's why you get, some old people who have grudges from 50 years ago that they're still angry about when they think about it. They're still angry about a fight they had with their brother or sister when they were children. All of us have seen this. And we just think, wow. By then, it's hardened to such a degree that it's really hard then to release it, as the Buddha said, to release that aggression and animosity and hostility. That's why it's incumbent upon us. It's our responsibility to let go now. For your sake. You don't want to be an old man or woman who's angry. You want to be an old man or woman who's wise and loving. And the only way we're going to get there is by starting now. And again, there's a couple of caveats I want to make. Caveats are like a sort of, a couple of things that have to be clarified. One is that when we're forgiving a past action in ourselves or others, we're not excusing it. We're not saying it's okay. Right? But what we're saying is, I don't want to carry this pain anymore. And I don't want it to be an inheritance that I give my children. So it's wanting to let go, not of the action and the harm, but of the sorrow, the pain, the hostility, the desire for vengeance, even, you know, eye for an eye. Alice is our dictionary. Necessary. I need the Hebrew English version. So so I want to go through a couple of stages. And again, if anyone has a question, ask, or hold your peace. First, we have to understand what forgiveness is and what it isn't. Okay, and that's why I was saying these sort of exceptions and these caveats that, like, forgiveness is the release we're doing in ourselves, and it may not have anything to do with the other person. It's an inner process in your heart and mind, and it's wanting to release the pain you're carrying. Okay, it's a desire to be free from suffering, first and foremost, and to know that a lot of the cause of suffering is some of the delusion, the greed and hatred that I'm carrying in relation to other people. That's one thing. Very true. The other thing that we should understand about what forgiveness is not is the economical sense. That sometimes they say the bank is yeah. So so the bank, when we talk about forgiving debt in financial terms, it means the debt's erased, right? The debt doesn't exist anymore. You know, so that means that, like, there's no responsibility, there's no debt, you don't have to pay back any money. Okay, and that's not what this this form of forgiveness is talking about. So we're not talking about that. Okay, you're doing your own liberation from the prison of, you know, the negativity that you've received from others, or also the negativity that perhaps you've given. And it's refusing anymore to be defined by it. And that's coming back to that vastness of you. So one thing is understanding. First, we want to understand the difference in what forgiveness is and what it isn't. Okay, we also want to start experiencing it, the sense of suffering in ourselves. So this sort of mindfulness is connected to our awareness practice and our mindfulness practice of being able to note and notice, you know, when guilt arises, okay, when anger or hostility arise, when judgment and condemnation arise, and when blame arises. And to notice that, you know, even though we feel that they're arising for a justified reason, we're not talking about the reasons right now. What we want to focus on is the experience of suffering that it causes you. We can point out responsibility without being blamed. Blame is self-righteous. It's saying, I'm right and you're wrong. Responsibility is saying there's healing that needs to be done and changes. And it's your job to do that. That's different, okay? So responsibility we all need to take. Blame is the sense of separation and suffering and the type of anger that comes out of it. It's the division of right and wrong, right? We want to assume responsibility. We want others to assume and to take on responsibility. We want to leave blame and aggression behind. So when you notice inside yourself and you start to observe deeply these different states, you see that some are just, causing dukkha. And that's a key there, saying this needs to be released. Now, another stage then of it is is arousing the loving heart, arousing some compassion and kindness, some metta and karuna. First and foremost for yourself, because if you are, reflecting on forgiveness, is it possible? What does it mean? Then you go and you reflect upon and you notice the suffering and the pain that you're experiencing from, past actions, mistakes of yours and of others, and the baggage that you're holding onto in relation to those. You notice that there's suffering. And then in response to suffering, what we want as our natural reaction as practitioners and Dharma people on the way is our response to pain is compassion. Our response to other sentient beings, including ourselves, is metta. We want others to be happy in ourselves. We want others and ourselves to not suffer. So when you experience suffering, that pain, it's like, may I be free of this? And offering forgiveness to yourself is a way of freeing that pain and suffering. Part of that is accepting you don't have to be loyal to the story. You don't have loyalty to that story. Okay, what does that mean? That a lot of our the pain and guilt and suffering and hostility that comes from past actions and mistakes and relationships is being revisited because of a story that we are attached to. And it's the story of our lives and their role in our lives, or our role in their lives. That story you should not have loyalty to. That's not a story that's written in stone. So you should notice that there's, that the suffering comes from often a kind of recycled narrative of who you are that keeps going around. And that narrative is a sort of attachment to self, to sense of self. So if you can accept on even an intellectual level, okay, that the self that you're constructing out of this, okay, is a construct, is something you're making moment by moment. It's not necessarily so this way. Also, we have to understand that this letting go and this forgiveness is a process that takes time and patience. Shantideva, in his Bodhisattva's way, the way of the Bodhisattva, a guide to the Bodhisattva path, has a very long chapter on patience. And when he's talking about patience, he's talking about patience in the practice of forgiveness. And patience in the Dharma expression of it, according to Shantideva, is more the English term of forbearance, being able to hold something, being able to accept it, to accept that this situation is not what you wanted, not what you wanted, but it is what it is. Here's a couple of verses from Shantideva that I want to share with you from his chapter on patience. The worship of Buddha's generosity and good conduct performed throughout thousands of eons. Hatred destroys it all. There is no evil equal to hatred. and no spiritual practice equal to patience. Therefore, one should develop patience with great effort. Feel no anger. I feel no anger towards physical pain and the like, even though they cause me intense suffering. Why should I feel angry with this? A person doesn't get angry at will, having decided, I shall get angry. Nor does anger well up after deciding, I shall well up. Whatever transgressions and evil deeds of various kinds there are, all arise through the power of conditioned factors. And there's nothing that arises independently. Therefore, if one sees an enemy or a friend behaving badly, one can reflect that there are specific conditioned factors that determine this. And therefore you can remain peaceful. Serenity, freedom from disease, joy in long life, the happiness of an emperor, prosperity. These the patient person receives while continuing in cyclic existence. Well, that's pretty over the top. But the message we can get from this verse on patience is that the negativity that ourselves and others produce are not just happening. They're the result of so many causes and conditions. And by understanding that interconnectedness, and you could even say the emptiness of that anger, it can release us by seeing some wholeness in this. Basically, there's a sort of saying that a harmed person causes harm. Harm causes harm. And this is a sort of a summary of what Shantideva is saying. That any type of anger or any type of transgression, any type of violence doesn't exist independently. It's the product of many causes and conditions. Mainly, the harm that person received. And onwards and backwards and backwards. And throughout all space and time. But what that can do for us specifically is when we observe violence, pain, hostility, instead of reacting in kind with anger, and of course that's the most common response, isn't it? Someone cuts you off, honks their horn, shouts at you, and what's your response? Is it like to bow? No, it's anger. Of course. We have these sympathetic nerves in our neurons, you know, and they kind of like these, the sitar strings underneath the main strings, they resonate in kind. Well, that's if we don't observe it happening. But by understanding the deep causes and conditions, we can say that this is, you know, a product of the suffering that's going on. Pain causes pain. Pain causes pain. And pain will not be ended by pain. And violence won't be ended by violence. So it's incumbent upon us, this is our responsibility, to project an alternative. This is not easy, and it doesn't happen like that. This is part of the principles of forgiveness, that it's a process. But by reminding yourself over and over again that people who cause hurt are deeply hurt, then part of our understanding and our approach can be compassion. Now, I don't want to start with the most difficult situations, but we can start with some easier things. Start with some easier things. You know, someone who upsets you a little bit, right? Small upsets, and the type of forgiveness we can do moment by moment with small things. And we start to train the mind. We start to train the mind so that we start to look at the wholeness of the person. And that wholeness means that they're a product of a lot of causes and conditions that have caused them harm. They are suffering. And they exist as a whole person with all the potential of a Buddha as someone who killed 1,000 people. So we can see two sides here. The fullness of the person and the deep connections that produced the actions that they're causing. That's when we're looking outside of ourselves. So coming back to those three levels of forgiveness, those three directions. There's the direction of forgiving someone else, asking forgiveness from someone else, and forgiving oneself. You may not be able to do that in person. And I think most of the work is being done within ourselves, but it's absolutely necessary in order to become more naturally loving and compassionate. So I want to share one last quote that I read from Elie Wiesel, who is somebody who could have taken his experience as a way of justifying perhaps a lot of anger and hatred. But he wrote a very powerful response to that experience. And here's what he said. He said, suffering gives you neither privileges nor rights. Suffering confers is to give you. Suffering confers neither privileges nor rights. It all depends on how you use it. If you use it to increase the anguish of yourself or others, you are degrading, even betraying that suffering. Yet the day will come when we shall understand that suffering can also elevate human beings. God help us to bear our suffering well. To bear it well, that's the forbearance, that's the patience of Shantideva. But what Elie Wiesel is reminding us, that your suffering doesn't give you any privileges over others to then contribute to their suffering or to wish them suffering. But it is our responsibility to take all of that suffering that as human beings is part of the human condition. It's called dukkha. But a deeper part of the human condition is called Buddha. So we want to relate our dukkha to Buddha. And then it will be transformed into compassion. So may we use it well. And honor the stages that we go through as we try to deal and forgive deeply. Some of the stages in Another teaching I read about it, they were comparing it to the stages of grief that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross famously wrote about, the 5 stages of denial and anger and bargaining and depression and acceptance. Those are the 5 stages of grief. So first, when we, have some sort of pain or suffering that we want to forgive, no, it's not possible. Not possible. I cannot forgive him. I cannot forgive myself. I can't. Right? That's the denial part. And then there's the anger. Why should I? Either you're angry at yourself or you're angry at the other person. Then there's the bargaining. I'll forgive them if they forgive me. It's like the reverse of an eye for an eye. If they, or bargaining with yourself. And then there's a sense of, there's a depression. Depression could just mean like, it's so pitiful. It's so sad. It's so sad. It really is sad. And that sadness is an important stage because it's the stage right before the final one of acceptance. You have to go into the deep sadness of all the pain that exists in yourself and others, the grief, in order to come out to the other side of acceptance. So that's part of the process of forgiveness that I think is necessary to go through in order to be a more loving and compassionate human being. And there's a lot of humility there because it means we don't know who they are, we don't know who we are, but we know that we are much more than what we think. And that humility will serve us to help us accept that, you're not defined by your past karma. And that was the big Buddhist revolution. Is the Buddha said, you can change your karma. You can change it. Even someone, as he said, of Angulimala, even what he said of Angulimala at the end, when he told his followers after he died, even someone who had committed such terrible evil can still, through strong effort, achieve enlightenment in this lifetime. So that's a very humbling thing, The one is recognizing the greatness of us, but at the same time is humbling what we think we know about ourselves and others. And because we know so little about them and why they do what they do, and even about ourselves, that opens a crack in the door. That opens the door a little to forgiveness. I read that some of the great examples that we have of people who seem to transcend their circumstances, like Elie Wiesel and Nelson Mandela, that actually Nelson Mandela spent much of his time in prison on Robben Island, very angry. He was very angry. It took him a long time to get over that anger because he realized it wasn't going to serve him or his cause. So let's commit to this lifetime work, because otherwise we're going to be old and angry. And I think I think there's another way. So before we finish with a couple of minutes of sitting, Is there anything anyone would like to share in this odd format of video talk?
Daniel?
I'm with you.
Okay, good evening. לכולם ערב טוב. Thank you very much. And I would like, if it's possible, for you to leave the recording available, but I would like to listen again. I wonder also in a past meeting that you see all the time. So so it looks like this also helps the process of forgiveness, because after a couple of years, that person is not the same person, right? It's almost a different person. So I wonder if with this idea of everything change also helps forgiveness. What do you
Mm. Yeah.
think? Or no?
No, definitely. The idea that we're changing moment by moment even, but over the years, definitely. And the challenge in the practice is to make the change more intentional and conscious. So the Buddha understood that you can make it, if you bring in intention, you can make any change you want, from a murderer to a Buddha. But if you don't, then the change is going to happen, but it's not going to be really positive change. We need to bring intention in to help the change go right. Otherwise, it's just going to go on the path of least resistance. So yeah, change is going to happen no matter what.
Oh, okay, I didn't know this concept. Oh. No, but also the changes also you can direct the personal change. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, that's called working on your karma, your own. We're not like the story is not written. We're writing it every day.
Thing, Daniel, sorry. Okay, that's interesting. And I would like also to ask you, in this process of forgiveness, isn't a must that the person, the other side, asks for forgiveness? I mean, if there is no what do you think? I mean, a situation of forgiveness, the other person also has to be open.
Yeah. Yeah. So we're not able to change their minds. And sometimes forgiveness is asked for and given in a superficial way. Like it's just done sort of like a kind of a mechanically. And that's not the type of forgiveness we're talking about here. We're talking about a process of changing your mind so that you're releasing the anger. Some people, if they're doing it by rote, asking and giving is not the same as doing. So there's this unity of thought, speech, and action. On that level of just asking and giving forgiveness is only the level of speech. But for it to become the level of speech, of thought and action, takes a lot longer process. They're all interrelated. We can work on the thoughts and the actions. And if someone, exchanges the speech with us, that's also one of the levels. And perhaps we need at some point to even ask forgiveness if we need to do that, or not. If it's someone who is perhaps, don't forget, there are situations of trauma and abuse, where it's not for you to then interact with that person who has caused terrible harm. You know, if someone has escaped harm or an abusive situation or violence, it's not for them to go back and say, you know, I forgive you. That's foolish to think that. The forgiveness there is wanting to no longer carry the anger and hatred in your heart. So it's not then at the level of speech and action. It's more on the level of thought for them. And that's a purification. We're trying to purify our thoughts so that we're no longer having unwholesome thoughts. And forgiveness is a way of purifying unwholesome thoughts. Now, if it is possible, say in a more local situation, to involve speech and action, that's also very, you know, useful. But it needs to be within the context of a much deeper process. You know, it doesn't mean much if you say to someone, or if they ask you, or you ask someone, you know, for forgiveness, and then you're kind of like, you know, you said it, you done it, and we're done. And no, the process of purifying the mind takes a lot longer. And that's what we need to really honor, to honor that.
Thank you.
Hi, Daniel. Hi. Good evening. How are you? I wonder, could you please say a word about the approach of the Tibetan to the Chinese occupation in context with forgiveness?
Sure. So again, the Dalai Lama has said in several occasions that I've read and heard that you know, in his morning prayers, he prays for the goodness of the Chinese. You know, he offers them prayers every morning. And this story of these nuns, which is true, a true story, and it's happened not just with them, but with other monks as well who escaped from Tibet. It's recognizing deeply two things. It's recognizing deeply two aspects of this practice and deep awareness. One, the suffering I received from them was bad enough. But if they change my mind and make me hate, then it's even worse. Okay? So that hatred, they're recognizing that hatred and anger is a form of suffering. And that's what they want to avoid. They want to avoid that suffering. It's not a given that you have to hate or be angry at someone who harms you. That's a conditioned response. What the Tibetans are trying to do is to condition a different response. The alternative response is compassion, of seeing the pain in you and the pain in them. That they're brainwashed, that they're angry, that they're hateful, and they suffer so much because of that. Why do we get angry at their pain and their hatred? I mean, why should that make us angry and hateful? Why? We know that anger and hatred is painful, and so we want to end pain. So that's what they're realizing. They're realizing these two sides. Causes suffering in me, and it's coming from their suffering as well. And as a commitment to end suffering, those nuns have taken that, you know, that vow, that Buddhist vow. You know, I want to end suffering for all beings. It's a bodhisattva vow. Sentient beings are numberless. I want to save them. So, you know, They're suffering, I'm suffering. That's what I want to end. I think it's, recognizing the inner suffering, not only the outer suffering. And with the Bodhisattva vow, with the vow to end suffering as a Buddhist practitioner, we want to train ourselves to not respond to hatred with hatred. It's so easy to do that. It's so easy. Look at your own experience. Look at your own feelings. And that was like the second stage here when I talked about these principles, these stages of forgiveness. One is to know what forgiveness is and what it isn't. And the second one is to look deeply at your experience when you're going through life, when you're going through your day. And to notice that when you're experiencing pain and aggression and hostility, and it's often in response to pain, aggression, and hostility that you receive, right? So by observing that as a form of suffering, then we want to keep our vow to end suffering. And that's kind of like the Buddha is teaching one thing, suffering and the end of suffering. So, if we really are wanting to commit to this path, then we want to end suffering in all its forms. In us, in those guards. And if they're angry, then they're just increasing the suffering. Suffering is physical and emotional and intellectual and spiritual forms. We want to end all forms of suffering. So I think that's what they're expressing. Is their commitment to compassion.
I guess it's not so simple when they're thrown to jail for years,
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Not simple at all. But what it requires is incredible strength of will. Incredible strength of will. Yes, that's the sort of, some of these qualities of patience, what Shantideva was talking about, forbearance, being able to hold the difficulty. That's forbearance. And that's another term of equanimity. So equanimity is there too. If we want to talk about some of the qualities that are supporting forgiveness, there's patience, forbearance, there's equanimity. Of course, there's compassion. So we can look at and link them up, and then you have sort of these pillars that are supporting the forgiveness. You need those pillars. You need those qualities.
Thank you.
Daniel, can I ask something? How are you doing? In Zen, you say to do without doing. Sometimes you really have to do. There's also the whole subject of duty. You have a duty sometimes. A soldier has a duty to fight. So the Tibetans, in a way, maybe they're giving up on their duty for their people, for the rights of their people, because you could also act without acting, do without doing, war without hatred. Even Jesus speaks about that, to love the enemy. It doesn't mean you have to surrender to him, but you don't have to hate. That means you could stand up for your right and still not be unpure in your mind. How can I say it?
Mm-hmm.
I'm talking about the subject, especially of duty. Different people have different duties in life. and could even be stronger than the need of let's say, of what you can see from the side as compassion or forgiveness.
I think it's an important point. And I think it sort of doesn't necessarily conflict, because the point is to not have any hatred, anger, aggression, hostility. But compassion isn't necessarily then, as the opposite of hatred. Love and compassion are not necessarily inactive or passive. Just like hatred is not necessarily active. Someone can just sit and hate someone else, right? And they're causing suffering in their mind and they're not doing anything about it. They're just like in a bad mood for years. Okay, so hatred and anger can be passive, and compassion and love can be active. So yeah, can you take your compassion and be involved with sort of a fight for positive change without being influenced by the negative emotions of others who oppose you? That's a very difficult practice. And that takes a really strong compassion and a really deep purification and letting go of hatred and anger. Right? Now, it doesn't mean that you have to have it all purified until you do some action. But we should be aware that when the action starts to be influenced by negative emotions, the results will not be good. So again, love and compassion, and even equanimity, the Brahma Viharas, are not defined as active or passive. They are a background to, deciding what is the right thing to do. And if it's from love and if it's from compassion, then the right choice will probably be made. And it may be to sit on your cushion, and it may be to go out and fight for a change. So I think that's the real question. Is your duty, if you want to use that word, being informed by your compassion? There's no duty for the sake of duty. Okay, that doesn't make a sense. But we want to fulfill duties because we think it's going to help in some way. It's going to help people to be happy and not suffer, if that's why we're doing something. So those are sort of the basic motivations. You got to be really clear of your intention when we're talking about this. And then what we're saying about the do of not doing and the action non-action is that we're taking this selfish, self-centered actor out of the picture. It means you're doing it without a sense of me. That's what it means, action non-action. It means not self-centered action.
I was specifically talking about Tibet, because on one hand they're not fighting, but on the other hand they're sending delegations all over the world to put pressure on China for their own independence. So they're kind of expecting others to do their work, when maybe all they have to do is take their own responsibility and do the change that they need to do. Dalai Lama is going around the world talking about Tibet, but maybe he has to be in Tibet and deal with what has to be done. Maybe that's his real duty. That's what I meant in terms of duty. Maybe you could start hiding behind it also, in a way.
It's a possibility. I mean, that's a possibility. because he's completely committed to nonviolence, it limits the sort of decisions you can make if you're actually in Tibet, because of the conditions there and the force of the Chinese. So he's probably making decisions based on what he thinks is possible at this point in time. And he could be wrong. But I think the discussion about what actions to actually take are a different one. I think the one here is what are the intentions behind the actions, and that's what I think they as practitioners want to focus on, and what we should focus on. So what political decisions they make, I think, is is a real debate.
Okay. Good.
I think we're going to spend a minute to sit quietly and sit quietly.
Sit without sitting.
Yes. Before we say goodnight. And so let's have some gratitude for this opportunity to purify our hearts and minds, and to relate to ourselves and others with more love and compassion. So I hope everyone has a good Shana Tova. I hope it's a good year for all of us and everyone in the world. And I appreciate your practice.